This is a review of the 1974 movie Steppenwolf, which is directed by Fred Haynes and stars Max von Sydow, Dominique Sanda, and Pierre Clementi. This is a pretty odd movie. I don't know if it's a great movie, but it is definitely an interesting movie, and I think this is a movie that is worth watching just because it is one heck of a ride for all the things that happen. I think this is another movie that's sort of good to have a guide for. This is a somewhat polarizing movie, I guess, and not very widely seen, but somewhat, some people have seen this. It's got a 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb with 1.1k votes. This is, first of all, Fred Haynes, the director of this, really has had a really short career. I don't entirely know why, but I suspect it has something to do with making really odd movies. And Wikipedia seems to suggest that his second wife fell ill with multiple sclerosis, and he moved to Ireland to help her get through that, which will also cut your career short. But either way, he at least blessed us with one extremely odd movie called Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf. What is a Steppenwolf? Well, Steppenwolf, famous band. I guess it's a character from the DC comics or something too, but it all started out actually with Hermann Hesse, famous German novelist, wrote a book called Steppenwolf that was about the wolf in the steppes, right, area in Mongolia, and about the duality of the human being duality of man, perhaps, as a very refined creature, but also a beast with perverse cravings and penchant for homelessness and lonelessness, vagrancy, and roaming. That book, fairly well known. This is a movie, is an adaptation of the book. I have never read the book, and I have no idea what the book must be like. If this is what the movie is like, hard to imagine what the book is. But who knows? So this movie starts out with Max von Sydow, whose character is sort of playing an intellectual, sort of an old European style intellectual. He was educated in a seminary, and he's written a number of books. You don't really learn about what, but he's sort of your placeholder European intellectual, and he's unhappy about that. The movie doesn't totally start with this, but very early in the movie, there's an sort of a animated introduction, which has narration from von Sydow sort of talking about his character, and has really interesting animation showing him as a wolf and also as a man. Now, I will say that the Steppenwolf idea of the man and the wolf, I actually think is not exactly the foremost theme of the movie, but it does come into play in a number of cases. What might be the foremost theme is the other thing that von Sydow discusses during this animation, which is the listlessness of the bourgeoisie, right? There's a nice line in the narration here where he talks about how the bourgeoisie are always in the middle. They're always trying to walk the line between good and evil, but never willing to be a martyr in spirit or a martyr in the flesh. So never able to commit to idealism, sort of aware of the evils and keeping away from them in a respectable manner, but not committing to what matters and to the good things in life. Put into a more modern parlance, von Sydow's character is a sad boy, basically, who is well-versed in this sort of intellectual world, but is missing a certain decisiveness or something. And he's really upset about this, and so upset, in fact, that he plans to kill himself on his 50th birthday. This first portion of the movie is really centered around the emptiness of the bourgeoisie and the intellectual life. And there's a lot of ways that this is portrayed, both sort of very explicitly with von Sydow planning to kill himself, but also through some other things in the movie. For instance, there's a scene where his character goes to meet with some sort of old friend or something like this, and they talk about Goethe and some other intellectual sort of stuffy things. And the movie really portrays this as really hams up how empty this all is. So he says something, and everyone reacts completely over the top, like it's the most interesting or the most controversial thing, when he just seems to think, oh, this is not meaningful, right? So by totally over embellishing the reactions, the movie kind of hammers home how empty it is. It's clear that Von Sydow is out of sync with these reactions, right? That he's no longer plugged into this, no longer bought into this idea of what matters and what is significant and what's worth thinking about and doing with your life, right? Approaching meaninglessness and emptiness. And he basically says that. He walks out on the family. He tells them that he's no longer that person, that he's no longer interesting, that he's irritable, and he is grumpy, right? And he is sort of, it's true. I mean, his self-diagnosis of irritability and grumpiness is spot on, but it's not, as he would maybe think in that moment, because of a fault in his character so much, as the movie would say. It's because of the sort of emptiness of that society in general. Now, the ironic thing about this first portion of the movie is that you might say, this movie is kind of debating the merit of bourgeoisie intellectualism. But surely debating the merit of bourgeoisie intellectualism, especially in this format of this kind of offbeat art house European film, surely that itself is bourgeoisie intellectualism, and this movie surely is. And the first part of the movie is totally, I think, open to that sort of, I guess, criticism. But the later portions of it are not at all, and I'll explain why. So Max von Sydow goes on to meet Dominique Sanda, or Mine, I think her character is named, and she is his gateway into a totally different way of thinking about his life and thinking about his purpose and his world, and whatnot. They meet at a club called the Black Eagle, or a bar, I think, called the Black Eagle. Later, there is a restaurant, or they go to a club called Pablo's, and they will meet Pablo. Later on, both of these are sort of strange underground locales with interesting traditions and odd, just sort of offbeat settings, reminiscent of the club in the movie Bell, Book, and Candle, if you know what that is, or maybe even like Club Silencio in Mulholland Drive or something like that. It's this sort of odd underground locale, and a total contrast to the sort of places that Max von Sydow has been hanging out. At first, it seems like the movie is portraying this as something that you should be anxious about, right? Something that is, and it is something that destabilizes the classic European intellectualism. But at first, like I said, they're treated as like these strange, off-kilter, foreign lands and whatnot that you should be afraid of and whatnot. But von Sydow, for whatever reason, embraces this, partly because he meets the beautiful Dominique Sanda, and she sort of doesn't, her character's a bit odd, and I think her performance overall is not her finest movie, acting wise, but nonetheless, it's partly because her character's the script is a little weird when it comes to who exactly she is, and whatnot. She very much serves as the bridge between the first part of the movie, though, which is kind of a slightly more standard intellectual sort of thing, and the second sort of phase of the movie, which is totally different. And maybe that's why her character comes off as just a little weird. So they meet at a bar. Max von Sydow just sort of sits down next to her. They begin talking. It turns out that she knows him from the past somewhere, not exactly clear how or where. He tries to guess her name, things like that. But the gist of it is that she begins pulling him into another world, another way of thinking about these things. And that sort of initially anxiety-invoking, destabilizing world of the clubs opens up into being a huge world of a different type of intellectualism. And this is really centered in the character Pablo, played by Pierre Clementi. Pablo is the namesake of Pablo's, the club. What kind of club is it? Well, of course, it's a jazz club, right? So Max von Sydow, being the traditional intellectual, has a huge fascination and interest in classical music. And this is paralleled or contrasted in the movie very starkly to jazz, this new, destabilizing, interesting type of music. Now, of course, today, people my age might think of jazz as the stuffy, old thing. But in 1974, or in this movie at least, it was seen very much as the new and the destabilizing, right? Pablo's at the center of that. He plays the saxophone in a band, and he also pulls Max von Sydow into this world. This Pablo character is interesting. Pierre Clementi is also in the movie Belle de Jour, and he he reminds me in both those roles of the actor Michael Gothard. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but maybe that's right. Who is in the movie The Devils, another really odd movie. All three of these roles, Michael Gothard in The Devils, and I forget the name of the character in Belle de Jour, and Pablo in Steppenwolf. From a distance, and from close up in some of the other movies, they seem sinister. Like sickly youths is, I think, how I would describe these, right? Sort of twisted, destabilized, unstable, and sickly youth is how you would see them at first. Pablo, sort of this otherworldly, should you trust this guy? Is he sort of a villain? Seems sort of sinister, but Von Sydow does, to some extent, trust him, and basically goes to embrace this world. Now, I've said embrace this world, sucked into this world a number of times. What is that world? Well, partly it's sort of this underground world. It's a little bit interesting because it sort of seems styled after like the Beat generation, even though it seems like that's not totally in sync with the timeline of the movie, but maybe it is. I'm not sure. There is an interesting moment also where Pablo steals a car and looks like almost the spitting image of from Breathless. Sort of similar thing going on there with the countercultural character. But what is the world? That's the question. Well, partly it's sort of staying up all night, going to various clubs. That's kind of the first step into it and whatnot. Actually, the very first step is that Dominique Sanda convinces Max von Sydow to dance with a woman, right? This is, I don't know. I mean, this is sort of an interesting question of whether or not this is actually true. But in the movie, it's sort of one of the first steps away from the stodginess of intellectualism and into a different sort of intellectualism, a different sort of way of understanding the world and things, is an embrace to some extent of some sort of risk, pleasures of the flesh, things like that. And so by leaving his comfort zone and dancing with this woman, Max von Sydow takes the first step into this world. The second step is to stay up all night and consume various substances with these people. And then the third step involves something called the Magic Theater. It's not entirely clear to me where the Magic Theater is or what it is, but it's some sort of, I think, drug-induced trip that Max von Sydow goes on. And this is where the style of the movie becomes really interesting. In this part of the movie, we already saw earlier on, they use some animation. But this part of the movie uses animation combined with live action. So, like Mary Poppins or bed knobs and broomsticks. We see Max von Sydow running around on this sort of painted background, having interesting experiences and whatnot. And here, like I said, the first part of the movie you could maybe say is sort of a bourgeoisie intellectualism in itself, right? Trying to understand the European condition with your own European art house movie, right? The second half of the movie, on the other hand, sort of departs from that because it really leaves behind traditional cinematic logic and just throws a lot of interesting images and ideas at you pretty quickly. I'm not going to attempt to go through the logic, whatever the logic may be, of that second part. I'm not going to try and go through all of the interesting things that happen in the Magic Theater. But suffice to say, a lot of the issues, including the Steppenwolf, the duality of man and beast, those things are all revisited through the Magic Theater and whatnot. The ideas of life are revisited sort of explicitly, but also really vaguely or really abstractly. I would say, yes, explicitly, but abstractly, revisited through the Magic Theater, which is a sort of psychedelic trip. So obviously, this is a very interesting and unique movie. The conclusions that are drawn at the end, I won't spoil them, but they sort of draw some conclusions about what Livy's next step is, rather than kill himself. The fate of Dominique Sanda's character, Hermine, is sort of weird and hard to understand what's going on. And Pablo continues to be somewhat shifty as a sort of trustworthy guide to this new world. But overall, the movie does seem to deliver on the answer, on one potential answer to this question of what is an alternative to bourgeoisie intellectualism. Well, psychedelia and a new, free, destabilized, non-institutional thought that has jazz and psychedelics and all these things involved with it. And the movie does, I think, a really good job of highlighting the differences. At the very least, it will show you some of the differences. And I don't mean to play down the actual intellectual importance of the Magic Theater and the thoughts that are on display there. I just don't want to go through and try and explain all of them because it's sort of a blur. Even now, I just watched it a few days ago, but it's sort of a blur what happens there. And I think it's best just experienced for yourself. So overall, like I said, this is an interesting movie. It's sort of a movie. I think if you, I just reviewed the movie Foxtrot. This movie is better than that one, I think, significantly. But it's definitely not like a conventional movie that everyone's going to like. And it's hard to even really explain or think about if it's so-called good or not, because what it's trying to do is fairly specific. And if you're interested in something else, then this movie might just seem like completely bizarre and strange. But overall, you got to give kudos to Fred Haynes for making an interesting, non-conventional movie that ends up more or less doing exactly what it sets out to. I think this is a cool hidden gem if you want a really interesting movie to check out. It's also not a boring movie, especially in the second half, because there's just so much new and unpredictable stuff that goes on. So this, I think, is more or less worth your time. A pretty cool movie to check out. And hopefully with some of these things in mind, you can understand, or you can get maximum enjoyment or intellectual stimulation out of it. That is the goal, right, of this series, which takes movies similar to this that are sort of odd, offbeat things and explains how tries to give an entry point, basically, into getting the most out of them, understanding what they're sort of about. If you've seen this movie and have any thoughts, let me know. Or if you have ideas for other ones like this that you want me to force myself to watch, I may give it a go. Just let me know. And I have a huge list of other things coming up, some of which are even more interesting, bizarre, odd, strange, off-kilter, underground films. Well, not really underground, but off the beaten path films that maybe more people should see, or maybe not. Either way, stay tuned because there's some more cool stuff coming.